I will have the disastrous
Это
war.
тоже часть общества.
出来白的面包吧。
Tavrınız olursa affola. Elçiye Zeval Olmaz. Elçiye Zeval Olmaz'dan herkese selamlar. Suriye hiç gündemden düşmüyor. Suriye Geçici Hükümeti Başkanı Al-Şara yeniden Türkiye'ye geliyor. Bir yanda SDG ile Damas arasında imzalanan anlaşma var. Diğer yanda İsrail geçtiğimiz günlerde Türkiye'nin üst kuracağı söylenilen altyapıyı vurdu. Ve zaten gergin olan ilişkiler daha da geridi. Şimdi karşılıklı yatıştırıcı mesajlar geliyor ve bir çatışmasızlık mekanizması var ya da oluşturulacak gibi gözüküyor. Suriye hakkında konuşacak çok şey var. Suriye'de kurulan yeni hükümet birlik ve düzeni sağlayabilir mi? Amerika'nın Suriye politikası nedir? Kimler karar mekanizmasında başı çekiyor? Amerika Suriye'den ne zaman çekilecek? Suriye'nin en büyük dış tehditleri hangi ülkeler? İran, İsrail ve Rusya'nın Suriye'deki geleceği ne olur? Türkiye'nin rolü ne olacak? YPG ne yapacak? Silah bırakacak mı? Tüm bu konuları Washington'ın önde gelen Suriye uzmanlarından Atlantic Council Orta Doğu Programları Kıdemli Araştırmacısı ve Suriye Çalışmaları yöneticisi meslektaşım Qutaiba İdlbi'yle konuşuyorum. Kaçırmayın, harika bir röportaj oldu. Qutaiba Atlantic Council, The Middle East Institute ve European Institute of Peace arasında Mart 2024'te başlatılan Suriye Stratejisi projesinin de mimarlarından. Proje kapsamında geçtiğimiz günlerde bir rapor yayınlandı. Reimagining Syria, yani Suriye'yi yeniden hayal etmek. Linkini açıklama kısmına ekliyorum. Şiddetle tavsiye ediyorum. Kanalıma abone olmayı unutmayın. Hadi başlayalım. Hi Qutaiba, thank you for joining Don't Shoot the Messenger.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with recent massacres of Alawites in Syria. Al-Shara promised to create an inclusive administration and recently announced a new transitional government. Do you think he can bring unity and inclusivity to Syria? And which countries might not want him to succeed?
I mean, I think there is definitely a lot of good steps in the right direction. The recent government has been relatively representative of the different communities in Syria. We've seen representation within the government for Alawites, for Christians, for Druze, for Kurds. I think there could have been definitely more representation of women just as a segment of society. But again, like I think compared to where we are right now, where the country is, I think we are on a good start at least, or on a good track. I think the question is of whether this would be able to bring peace or not. It's really related to the government's ability to assert control over all of the country. I think the main challenge that is facing the country on one hand is security. So the country has a very limited security force that is able to really enforce security, protect all the different communities. So I think we will see challenges around security probably for a couple of years before things settle down. It's not because, I mean, those challenges are in place because the country has just left a 14 years civil war. A community basically, or communities that are completely armed. So a real DDR process will take some time. And again, establishing a good, strong security force will take some time before there will be real security, especially across the whole country. I think there are some metropolitan centers that are now relatively safer than others, especially in Damascus and Aleppo. But for the full country, I think it will take some time. I think the other challenge for communities to feel really safe and represented is also the economic challenge. I think when sanctions are lifted, when the country is able to move forward, the challenge for the government will be specifically around its development vision. So how to make sure that different communities in Syria are able to secure their living, there are enough jobs, but also they feel that development specifically in any good reflections of an increase in GDP is reflected over all communities in Syria. When it comes to external challenges, I think the number one external challenge for Syria right now is this alignment of interest between Iran and Israel to really destabilize the country. We've seen how Iran has been investing in former Assad regime officers from the military, from the security, to create instability across the country by doing attacks, by trying to smuggle weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. But also we see specifically the Benjamin Netanyahu government trying to destabilize the situation by continuous attacks, by incursions, but also by the kind of the language that the Israeli government is using to instigate sectarian tensions across the country, whether that is with the Druze community in the south or the Alawite community in the north. I think over time, those are like over the next few years, those are the top two also external challenges that the Syrian government will have to deal with. How to kind of like push Netanyahu's government back, reduce its impact on stability in Syria, but also be able to protect the sovereignty of Syria, which is now being violated on a daily basis by Israel. I think Iran is a manageable threat over the long term. I think as the country stabilizes more, Iran will find less and less space to intervene in Syria. And I don't think there is a way for Iran to come back in any shape or form. While Russia, for example, may be able to preserve some interest in Syria, can manage to build a new relationship with the Syrian state. It's something that Putin has basically communicated to Shara in their meetings, basically focusing that Russia's relationship is with Syria, not with the Assad regime. I don't think Iran will be able to manage the same at any point on the short or medium term.
Thanks much. Who could imagine that Iranian and Israeli interests could be aligning? Unbelievable.
Yes.
So this
and I mean, especially,
go ahead.
Especially, I think for like the Netanyahu government, I mean, at the time where they say that Iran continues to be the biggest threat, at the time where they continue to push to have a military attack on Iran, led by Israel and by the United States, at the exact same time, they're actually destabilizing Syria in a way that can only benefit Iran. I don't think it even benefits Israel to destabilize the Syria, but it can definitely benefit Netanyahu in a sense to try to escape forward from the internal challenges that he's facing inside Israel.
Absolutely. So this brings the question of the US. What will be the US position? And can you tell me who in the current US administration is in charge of Syria at the highest level? And whether Trump set a specific timeline for CENTCOM to pull US forces out? Because we've been reading also reports that the US gave the Syrian government a list of demands, a to-do list in exchange for easing sanctions. So what generally do you think the US policy in Syria will look like moving forward?
Okay, so let me start by first who's managing the Syria policy right now. So we definitely have a policy vacuum in a sense because there is no leadership on Syria or on the Middle East portfolio overall. We have some leadership, of course, in the White House on the Middle East overall, but specifically on the issues that the president cares about, Israel, Gaza, the Abraham Accords, relationships with the GCC. But otherwise, we still see kind of like a vacuum in terms of the policy itself, especially on the State Department side. And that is normal in a sense because there has been no confirmations yet on that at State Department level. I think it's worrying that those confirmations might take some time. But within that vacuum, then you have different senior people within the administration trying to fill that vacuum. And I think there is kind of like two lines of policy. There is one led by Secretary Rubio, who's pro more engagement with Damascus, who's pro a gradual lifting of sanctions, again, to utilize this opportunity where Iran and Russia are finally out of Syria and to try to kind of shift Syria into the right direction, but also set up Syria for success. So you have this one direction led by Secretary Rubio, I think to a lesser extent, perhaps Special Envoy Witkoff and his team also realizes this opportunity and they want to engage with Damascus. On the other hand, you have a team led, or basically like a direction led by the CT, Senior Director at the NSC, Sebastian Gorka, and others within the White House who want to continue to isolate Syria, who perhaps want to do actually more sanctions on Syria because of how they feel about, HTS, about its former affiliations, or its history. And definitely, I think, among this team, there is no appetite for engagement or any sort of sanction relief. So this is kind of like where we are. I think we see some of that in some direction or some messaging that comes from the administration. And that's why I think sometimes there's some conflict between some messaging and another. So definitely messaging coming out from the NSC is coming a lot stronger on the negative side, while messaging from State Department is coming more on the positive side. I think there's a question of where things would go, and that would lead us to what the priorities for the president are. I think for President Trump, there are two priorities. One, which is pulling out U.S. troops from Syria. U.S. CENTCOM has provided different plans to the president, whether it is, it can start with a 30 days withdrawal plans or up to 1 year. I think just looking at the agreement that happened between the SDF and Damascus and the timeline basically to have withdrawal by the end of the year, I think perhaps this is where the president thinking is. Stabilize the situation, give it some time. If it looks good, then it's easy for the president to pull forces. But definitely when it comes to Syria, that is a number one priority. I think if Syria is to come to the president's table and mind, I think the other topic that will be in mind is some sort of engagement or normalization track between Syria and Israel. I think that is the one other topic where the president would be much more interested and where he would actually be taking the lead on dictating where the Syria policy would go. Over the next few years, though, so it really depends on whether there will be kind of like this track to at least, stabilize the situation, going back to the 1974 deconfliction line, figuring out some, sort of normalization between Syria and Israel. If that is to be the case, then definitely, again, like the president will engage fully on that, and we will see more diplomatic engagement, more sanction relief. The question of where the policy would go is really dependent on what would happen with the confirmation process. And it will really depend on the personnel who will come into the State Department to lead on the policy portfolio, because we see this diversion between senior principals within the Trump administration about what to do in Syria. In terms of what is needed, I think the Trump administration should really move forward with more engagement with removing sanctions on Syria. Not only because it is the ethical choice. I think we are in a space where arguing for the ethical choice is a lost argument to start with. But because it's actually better for the U.S. national security interest to start on such page. We are finally at a stage where Syria has strategically shifted, and there is an opportunity to connect with Syria and have Syria as a space that is part of the U.S. geopolitical puzzle in the region, rather than push it back into Russia and Iran's geostrategic puzzle. And that can only happen through engagement. So that is on one hand. On the other hand, if we really want to make sure that Iran and Russia continue to be out of Syria, we need to set up Syria for success. Right now, because the Trump administration continues to impose U.S. sanction programs on Syria, it is setting up Syria for failure. And the only way to change that is by removing sanctions. So that needs to be a priority over the next 3 to 4 years during the Trump administration.
So you mentioned the agreement between al-Shara and Abdi, the SDF. So recently we heard from Rojava that they don't recognize the transitional government in Syria. And on the other hand, regarding the agreement between al-Shara and Abdi, it looks like the key issues are far from being resolved. such as the SDF integration into the Syrian army or oil revenue sharing. So what role do you see for the SDF and YPG in Syria's future? Could Syria end up with a federal system or a Kurdish autonomous region like in Iraq?
So one, on the agreement itself, I agree with you. I think the SDF and Abdi were forced to sign this agreement due to pressure from the American side. And I think Abdi saw in the agreement an opportunity to buy more time until conditions may shift in his favor. Over the long term, I think there is an opportunity for a more localized system, specifically in Kurdish communities, those that are north of the M4 in northeast Syria. However, I don't think there is a future for the SDF or the YPG to continue controlling the regions that they are controlling now. The vast majority of whom are Arab majority communities in Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa and Haseke'de. And that is specifically the case, when refugees and displaced communities started coming back. Because then the concentration, the YPG will find itself as one of the, like a small minority, basically, like a 1% or less minority trying to control a vast majority Arab community in those regions. If the YPG wants to preserve some of the achievements for Kurdish communities in northeast Syria, it needs to withdraw back to Kurdish communities and try to basically negotiate for some, again, decentralized roles, a recognition of cultural rights and other rights in those Kurdish communities, whether it is north of the M4, whether in Afrin, basically in spots where there is sizable concentrated Kurdish presence. And that is not the case in Raqqa, that is not the case in Deir ez-Zor, that's not the case in the majority of Hasaka province. So again, I think if that mentality shifts, I think there is an opportunity to secure more space for the Kurdish identity in those communities. I worry that the YPG will try to gamble its hand, basically, and eventually would lead us, because of its inability to go through a fair agreement, at least fair for not only Kurdish communities, but also fair for Arab communities of northeast Syria. Because of that, I worry that eventually they would lead the situation to a confrontation and to a military solution rather than a peaceful solution.
I hope not. But yeah. So let's talk about Turkey. You recently had a roundtable with Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan in DC. Turkish policy on Syria, and what future do you see for Turkey?
I mean, Turkey realizes the opportunity that exists in Syria, but also it doesn't really have the luxury to not care and not to engage with Syria, especially with the 900 kilometers borders on its southern borders. Because of, there are so many national security topics, not only related to the YPG PKK on the southern borders, but because of the type of relations, the trade itself, Syria is the gateway for Turkey into the Arab world, a huge potential market for Turkey's agriculture and Turkey's industries. It is also because of the human capital there. It's of course, of national security importance because of public health issues. So there is no way for Turkey not to engage in Syria in all ways possible. I think, however, number one worry on the agenda is definitely the Netanyahu government actions in Syria. So basically the security and military situation. Turkey cannot live, rightly so, with a bordering country that have zero sovereignty, but also that is destabilized as a result of Israeli actions in Syria. It's clear that security is number one on the agenda right now. There will be an agreement signed between President Shara and President Erdogan to establish Turkish military presence in Syria through joint defense cooperation, especially focused on rebuilding Syria's air defense capabilities to be able to reestablish sovereignty and push back against Israeli aggression in Syria, which I think would be very helpful for Syria's and Turkey's national security interest. I think after that, there are currently a lot of conversations over how can Turkey engage in supporting other strategic infrastructure in Syria when it comes to energy, when it comes to communication. I don't think there is anything set yet. I think the number one issue that will need to be dealt with is at least providing some sanction relief. So not only Turkey, but others can engage meaningfully on the economic level, on the reconstruction level in Syria. Because without that sanction relief, I think it would be very hard for Turkish businesses to seriously engage in Syria without the fear of any fallback from the US side when it comes to regulatory environment. The agenda right now is really around improving security, improving sovereignty of Syria, rebuilding its military capability, but also, on the other hand, trying to see the opportunity to support reconstruction efforts and support economic development in Syria. I think between those two, Minister Fidan was very kind of straightforward on the needs to engage with Damascus, the need to actually empower Damascus, especially on the human capital level. I think we all have a realization that because of the brain drain that Syria witnessed in the last decade or so, I think there is a huge need for Syria's diaspora to re-engage with Damascus and try to support as much as possible, especially with expertise that are capable of basically bringing Syria up to the challenge that it is facing in the next decade.
Qutaiba, thank you so much for your great insights.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.